The autumn sun was just beginning to warm up the morning sky at JFK International Airport as a woman in her late 30s walked confidently through the private aviation terminal. She wore a simple pair of dark blue jeans paired with a cream-colored blazer. Comfortable yet professional, perfect for her packed day of meetings. Her natural hair was styled in a neat bun, and she carried a worn leather briefcase that had accompanied her through countless business deals. Just an hour earlier, she had closed a meeting with potential investors who were eager to partner with her aviation consulting firm. The meeting had gone exceptionally well, and she was looking forward to heading back home to prepare for the next phase of her company's expansion. Running one of the fastest-growing aviation consulting firms in the country wasn't easy, but she had built it from scratch over 15 years, turning her dream into a reality despite all odds. As she approached her company's private jet on the tarmac, the crisp autumn breeze carried the familiar scent of jet fuel. The sleek aircraft stood gleaming in the morning light, its pristine white exterior decorated with her company's logo, a design she had sketched herself on a coffee shop napkin years ago, when this was all just a dream. Something felt different today, though. She didn't recognize the crew standing at the bottom of the jet stairs. Her regular flight team, people who had worked with her for years, were away on their annual vacation. This new crew had been contracted just for today's flight. Walking across the tarmac, she noticed how the ground crew members glanced at her with subtle confusion. She was used to these looks, the slight double takes, the questioning gazes. After 15 years in the aviation industry, she had grown accustomed to being underestimated. But it never ceased to amaze her how people made assumptions based on appearance alone. As she reached the base of the stairs, she adjusted her blazer and gripped her briefcase a little tighter. A few other passengers, all in formal business attire, were already boarding the aircraft. They were executives from partner companies who were sharing the flight back to the West Coast. She could hear their loud conversations about golf courses and weekend plans floating down from inside the cabin. The new flight attendant stood at the top of the stairs, clipboard in hand, carefully checking off passengers as they boarded. When she looked down and saw the woman approaching, her professional smile flickered for just a moment. It was a subtle change in expression, but one that the woman had seen countless times before. She took a deep breath and began climbing the stairs, mentally preparing herself for what she knew was about to unfold. Little did the flight attendant know that she was about to learn a valuable lesson about assumptions, one that would not only change her perspective, but would eventually lead to significant changes in the private aviation industry. For now, though, the woman simply continued her climb up the stairs, carrying with her years of experience in handling such situations with grace and dignity. The sound of her heels on the metal steps echoed in the morning air, each step bringing her closer to what would become a memorable moment in her journey as a CEO. The early morning sun cast her shadow long across the tarmac behind her, almost like a visual reminder of how far she had come, and the path she had traveled to reach this point. The morning had started so well at JFK International Airport. Now, standing at the top of those private jet stairs, the accomplished CEO found herself facing a situation she knew all too well. The new flight attendant's welcoming smile vanished the moment she saw her approaching. Without even glancing at the passenger list, the attendant stepped forward, blocking the entrance to the aircraft. "I'm sorry, but this is a private flight," the attendant said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "You must have the wrong aircraft." She spoke slowly and loudly, as if talking to someone who might not understand English well. Inside the cabin, several other passengers had stopped their conversations to watch. They were all wearing expensive suits, their designer briefcases safely stowed away. One man even chuckled, whispering something to his colleague. The CEO could feel their stares, but this wasn't her first time dealing with such assumptions. She tried explaining calmly, "Actually, I'm supposed to be on this flight." But before she could finish, the flight attendant cut her off. "Ma'am, this is a corporate private jet. Are you sure your ticket isn't for the main terminal?" The attendant's tone grew more condescending with each word. She kept one hand hovering near her radio, ready to call security. A man in a pinstripe suit, who had been watching the scene unfold, decided to chime in. "Maybe you should check with your boss about which flight you're supposed to be on," he suggested, smirking. These mix-ups happen all the time. The CEO took a deep breath, remembering similar moments throughout her 15-year career. She'd built her company from nothing, turning it into one of the most respected aviation consulting firms in the country. Yet here she was, being treated like she didn't belong on her own aircraft. The situation got worse when the co-pilot emerged from the cockpit. He'd overheard the commotion and came to investigate, his face showing concern, not for her, but about her. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, directing his question to the flight attendant while barely acknowledging the CEO's presence. The other passengers watched with mixed expressions, some amused, others uncomfortable, but none stepping forward to help. The morning sun streamed through the cabin windows, highlighting the absurdity of the scene. A successful business owner being questioned about her right to board her own company's jet. She could feel her heart beating faster, not from nervousness, but from a familiar frustration. Years of similar experiences had taught her to handle these moments with grace, even when it wasn't easy. She stood there, calm and composed, knowing that what happened next would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. The flight attendant was now reaching for her radio, ready to call security. "Ma'am, if you don't have the proper documentation, I'll need to ask you to leave." Her finger hovered over the call button, waiting for any excuse to press it. Little did they know, this moment was about to turn into a powerful lesson about assumptions and respect, one that would ripple through the entire private aviation industry. The CEO adjusted her blazer, reached into her briefcase, and prepared to show them exactly who they were dealing with. The morning breeze drifted through the cabin door, carrying with it the sound of distant planes taking off. In just a few moments, everyone on that jet would learn an unforgettable lesson about judging people by their appearance, and the true meaning of leadership. The tension in the private jet's cabin grew thicker with each passing moment. The CEO remained standing at the entrance, her expression calm despite the disrespect being thrown her way. She'd faced situations like this before, but something about this particular morning felt different. Maybe it was because this was happening on her own aircraft, or perhaps she was just tired of letting such moments slide by. "I understand there's some confusion," she began, keeping her voice steady and professional. "If you'd just check the passenger manifest." But once again, the flight attendant cut her off mid-sentence. "Ma'am, I've been working private aviation for 8 years," the attendant declared, puffing up with self-importance. "I know all our regular clients, and I can assure you that you're not on this list." She tapped her clipboard for emphasis, still not bothering to actually look at it. The other passengers were now fully invested in the scene unfolding before them. A woman in the back row had the decency to look uncomfortable, while 2 businessmen near the front continued their not-so-subtle whispers and glances. "Look," said one of the men, rising from his leather seat, "we're all running late here. Why don't you just head back to the terminal and sort this out with your company?" He adjusted his expensive watch, making sure everyone could see it glinting in the morning light. The co-pilot, who had been hovering nearby, stepped closer. "I can escort you back to the terminal building," he offered, as if doing her a favor. These mix-ups can be embarrassing, but it's better to sort them out on the ground. The CEO looked around the cabin. At the plush leather seats she had personally selected during the jet's renovation, at the company logo supplely embossed on the cabin walls, at the custom mahogany trim she had chosen to match her office decor. Every inch of this aircraft reflected choices she had made, yet here she stood, being treated like an intruder. She could feel her heartbeat quickening, not from fear, but from a deep sense of purpose. This moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been judged unfairly, every professional who'd been underestimated, every dream that had been dismissed because of how someone looked. The flight attendant was now speaking into her radio, her voice low but clear. "Security, we have a situation at Gate C4. She paused, giving the CEO one last chance to leave voluntarily. Two ground crew members appeared at the bottom of the jet stairs, responding to the call. The morning sun cast their long shadows of the steps, making the situation feel even more dramatic. But the CEO didn't move. Instead, she reached into her bag with deliberate slowness. Years of building her company had taught her patience, had shown her that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice was to stand your ground with dignity. "Before you call security," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone pause, "I think there's something you should see." Her hand emerged from her bag, holding several documents that would change the entire dynamic of this situation. The other passengers leaned forward in their seats, curiosity getting the better of their previous disdain. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to hold its breath along with everyone else, waiting to see what would happen next. This moment, though tense, was about to transform into something none of them expected. A lesson that would stick with them long after the flight had ended, a story they would tell for years to come, and a change that would ripple through the entire private aviation industry. The air inside the private jet had become heavy with tension. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows caught dust particles floating in the air, making them dance like tiny stars in the uncomfortable silence. The CEO stood her ground at the entrance, her hand still in her bag, while everyone waited to see what would happen next. The co-pilot had moved closer, his hand outstretched as if ready to escort her down the stairs. "Ma'am, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be," he said, trying to sound authoritative, but betraying a hint of nervousness. "We have a schedule to maintain." Below, the two security officers had started climbing the stairs. Their footsteps echoed against the metal steps, creating a rhythm that matched the CEO's steady heartbeat. She'd built her company from the ground up, turning a small consulting firm into an aviation empire, and now she was being treated like an intruder on her own aircraft. One of the businessmen in the cabin checked his expensive watch again, sighing loudly. "This is ridiculous," he announced to no one in particular. "Some of us have important meetings to attend." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on the CEO. She was actually heading to one of the most significant meetings of the quarter. The flight attendant had moved her hand to her radio again, ready to escalate the situation further. "Security is almost here," she said with an air of satisfaction. "Last chance to leave on your own terms." The CEO took a deep breath, remembering all the moments that had led to this one. The countless nights spent studying aviation regulations, the early mornings reviewing contracts, the years of proving herself in an industry that hadn't always welcomed her. Each experience had prepared her for moments like this. Through the cabin windows, she could see other private jets parked nearby. One of them bore the logo of a company she had recently advised during a major expansion. Another belonged to a firm that had tried to buy her out last year, offering millions for what she had built. She had declined. Her company wasn't just about money, it was about changing the industry itself. The security officers were now just a few steps away. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the cabin floor, adding to the dramatic tension of the moment. One of them reached for his radio, presumably to call for backup. "This is your final warning," the flight attendant declared, her voice sharp with impatience. "Leave now, or we'll have you removed and charged with attempting to board a private aircraft without authorization." The CEO looked around the cabin one more time, taking in the faces of everyone present. Some looked annoyed, others uncomfortable, and a few seemed genuinely curious about what would happen next. Little did they know, they were about to witness something that would change their perspectives forever. She could feel the weight of the moment, the importance of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, every professional who had been underestimated, every dream that had been dismissed because of how someone looked. With calm determination, she finally pulled her hand from her bag. The documents she held would do more than just prove her right to be there. They would become a catalyst for change in an industry that desperately needed it. The morning light caught the gold embossing on the papers, making them shine like a beacon of truth about to be revealed. Every person on that jet was about to learn a powerful lesson about assumptions, respect, and leadership, one that would stay with them long after this flight had ended. The CEO straightened her blazer, held her head high, and prepared to turn this moment of confrontation into an opportunity for transformation. The private jet cabin fell silent as the CEO held up her company ID and aircraft documentation. Time seemed to freeze for a moment as everyone stared at the Golden Company logo embossed across the top of her credentials, the same logo that was painted on the tail of this very aircraft. "I believe you'll find everything in order," she said quietly, her voice carrying a natural authority that needed no volume to command attention. "This is my company's jet, and I'm the CEO of Skywise Aviation Consulting." The flight attendant's face drained of color so quickly that she had to grab the nearby seat to steady herself. The co-pilot, who had been ready to help remove her from the aircraft, now stood with his mouth slightly open, his previous confidence evaporating like morning dew under a hot sun. We, the flight attendant stammered, her clipboard slipping from her trembling fingers and clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the cabin, making several passengers jump in their seats. The security officers at the stairs took a step back, suddenly very interested in their shoes. The businessman who had been checking his watch and making comments about important meetings seemed to shrink in his seat. His expensive watch didn't look quite so impressive anymore. Another passenger quickly pulled out his phone, no doubt Googling the company and its CEO, his eyes widening as the search results confirmed what she had just revealed. "But I didn't expect." The flight attendant tried again, her words trailing off into uncomfortable silence. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the truth of their assumptions for all to see. The CEO took a slow breath, remembering all the similar moments that had led to this one. She thought about the young girl she once was, dreaming of aviation while everyone told her it wasn't her world to enter. She thought about the countless doors that had been closed in her face and how she'd built her own doors instead. "I understand," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You didn't expect the CEO to look like me." She gestured to the empty seat at the front of the cabin, her usual spot. "Shall we talk about those expectations?" The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking guilty, others embarrassed. The co-pilot had removed his hat and was clutching it to his chest, his face showing the dawning realization of what had just happened. One of the security officers cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we sincerely apologize. We didn't know," he began, but she raised her hand gently to stop him. "That's exactly what we need to discuss," she said, setting her briefcase down and taking her seat. "Because this isn't just about me or this flight or even this company. It's about something much bigger." The morning light caught the wing of the aircraft, sending a bright reflection through the cabin. It felt like a spotlight on this moment, a moment that would change not just everyone present, but potentially the entire industry's approach to assumptions and bias. She gestured to the flight attendant and co-pilot. "Please, sit down. All of you." Her voice was kind but carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "We have some time before takeoff, and I think this is an opportunity for all of us to learn something valuable." The CEO settled into her leather seat at the front of the cabin, her presence now commanding a different kind of attention. Everyone watched as she placed her briefcase carefully beside her, took a sip of water from a bottle in the seat pocket, and looked around at the faces before her. 15 years ago, she began, her voice warm but strong. "I walked into a bank asking for a loan to start an aviation consulting firm. The bank manager asked me 3 times if I was in the right place. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He suggested I might want to start a smaller business, maybe a beauty salon." The flight attendant had sunk into a nearby seat, still clutching her dropped clipboard. The co-pilot stood awkwardly, unsure whether to return to the cockpit or stay for what was becoming an impromptu lesson in humility. I didn't get that loan, the CEO continued, a small smile playing at her lips. But I did get something valuable that day, the determination to prove that capabilities have nothing to do with appearances. She gestured to the cabin around them. This jet? I bought it last year. It was the same day that bank manager called my office, wanting to handle our company's accounts. A businessman in the third row loosened his tie slightly, perhaps feeling the weight of his earlier dismissive comments. The morning sun had risen higher now, filling the cabin with golden light that seemed to underscore the importance of this moment. I started in a tiny office, barely bigger than this jet's bathroom, she said, drawing a few nervous chuckles. I worked 18-hour days, learned everything I could about aviation, and knocked on doors until my knuckles were sore. Many of those doors stayed closed, not because I lacked knowledge or experience, but because I didn't fit someone's image of what a CEO should look like. She paused, looking directly at the flight attendant who had tried to remove her from the plane. I'm not sharing this to make anyone feel bad. I'm sharing it because right now, somewhere, there's another person being told they don't belong. And maybe by talking about this, we can help change that. The security officers had quietly retreated down the stairs, but their departure barely registered as everyone listened intently. Even the most dismissive passengers from earlier were now leaning forward, caught up in her words. This company isn't just about aviation consulting, she continued, gesturing to the logo on the wall. It's about changing perceptions. Every contract we sign, every service we provide, shows that excellence comes in all forms. Success doesn't have a specific look. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a well-worn notebook. This holds my first business plan. I still keep it to remind me of where I started. Back then, people told me I was reaching too high, dreaming too big. She smiled. Now they call me for advice on how to reach those same heights. The tension in the cabin had transformed into something else. A shared moment of understanding, perhaps even inspiration. The morning light caught the CEO's eyes as she looked around at her audience, seeing the impact her words were having. So, here's what I suggest, she said, leaning forward slightly. Instead of letting this become an uncomfortable memory we'd all rather forget, let's make it a turning point. A moment when we all decided to look past our initial judgments and see people for their true capabilities. The atmosphere in the private jet had transformed completely. The same cabin that minutes ago had been filled with tension now held a different kind of energy. The CEO looked around at her audience, seeing faces that showed genuine interest instead of judgment. Let me share something with you, she said, pulling out her phone and opening a photo gallery. This is our company's first office holiday party. She turned the screen to show a small group of people gathered in what looked like a tiny break room. We had pizza on paper plates and used folding chairs. But every person there believed in the vision of creating something different in the aviation industry. The flight attendant, who had been quiet for some time, finally spoke up. Her voice was soft but sincere. I've been in aviation for 8 years, she said, and I've never stopped to think about how many times I might have made assumptions about people. Not just today, but every day, the CEO finished for her gently. It happens in small ways. The way we greet people, the tone we use, the assumptions we make about who belongs where. She gestured to the businessman who had been so dismissive earlier. Even successful people can fall into these patterns without realizing it. The businessman nodded slowly, his earlier arrogance replaced by thoughtful reflection. I've been flying private for 10 years, he admitted. And I guess I had a certain image in my head of what a CEO should look like. That's pretty embarrassing to admit. Outside the window, another private jet taxied past, its engines humming. The CEO watched it for a moment before continuing. You know what's interesting? Every time something like this happens, I have 2 choices. I can get angry, and believe me, sometimes I want to. Or I can turn it into a teaching moment. She stood up and walked to the center of the cabin. Look around this aircraft. The leather seats, the wood paneling, the entertainment system. I chose every detail. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because I believe in excellence. The same excellence I expect from everyone who works with our company. The co-pilot, who had been standing quietly near the cockpit, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need to apologize. We were completely out of line, and I'm ashamed of how we acted." "Thank you," she replied, "but let's turn that shame into action. When you fly tomorrow, or next week, or next year, remember this moment. Remember how easy it is to judge someone based on how they look, and how wrong those judgments can be." She turned to address everyone in the cabin. In our industry, we talk a lot about safety protocols and checklists. Maybe we need a different kind of checklist, one that helps us check our biases before we make decisions about people. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows through the cabin windows. Someone's phone buzzed with a message, but for once, nobody reached to check it. They were all too engaged in this unexpected lesson. The most powerful changes, the CEO continued, often start in moments like this. Small moments when we realize our mistakes and decide to do better. It's not about feeling guilty. It's about growing and helping others grow too. She picked up a company brochure from a seat pocket and held it up. The cover showed a diverse group of aviation professionals working together. "This isn't just marketing," she said. "This is our vision for the future of aviation. A future where nobody has to prove they belong, because we've stopped questioning who belongs in the first place." Instead of filing complaints or demanding dismissals, the CEO chose a different path. As the private jet cruised at 30,000 feet, she pulled out her laptop and began drafting a new company policy right there in her seat. The flight attendant, who had been quietly serving drinks to the other passengers, paused beside her. "I know you probably want me fired," the flight attendant said softly, her hands trembling slightly as she held the serving tray. "And I would understand completely." The CEO looked up from her laptop and smiled warmly. "Actually, I have something else in mind. Would you like to be part of making real change?" She turned her screen to show a document titled New Training Initiative, Breaking Bias in Aviation. The morning light caught tears in the flight attendant's eyes as she set down her tray and took the seat across the aisle. "I didn't just misjudge you once," she admitted. "I've probably been making snap judgments about passengers for my entire career. I just never realized it until today." The businessman who had been so dismissive earlier raised his hand like a schoolboy. "I run a tech company," he said, his voice carrying a new humility. "Would it be possible to get a copy of that training program once it's done? We could probably use it too." Over the next hour, as the aircraft cruised through clear skies, something remarkable happened. The cabin transformed into an impromptu workshop. Passengers who had earlier looked down their noses at the CEO now eagerly contributed ideas for making the aviation industry more inclusive. The co-pilot, during his breaks from the cockpit, shared stories of his own biases he never acknowledged before. "You know," he said, "I've been flying for 12 years, and I've never had a female instructor or examiner. I never even thought about why that was wrong until today." The CEO typed rapidly, capturing every suggestion. Her original plan for a simple training program was growing into something much bigger. Ideas flowed freely now. Mentorship programs, recruitment initiatives, industry-wide awareness campaigns. "What if," suggested one passenger who worked in marketing, "we created a video series sharing stories like what happened today? Real experiences that make people think about their own assumptions." Another passenger, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "I'm on the board of a private aviation company. We need this kind of training, not just as a one-time thing, but as part of our core operations." The flight attendant, who had started the day by trying to remove the CEO from the plane, was now passionately describing her vision for change. "We need to start with the basics: how we greet people, how we make assumptions, how we can do better." Looking around the cabin, the CEO saw something powerful happening. The very people who had judged her hours earlier were now becoming advocates for change. Their embarrassment had transformed into determination to make things better. "You know what's amazing?" she said, pausing in her typing. "This morning, I thought I was just heading home from a business meeting. Instead, we're creating something that could change our entire industry." The businessman checked his expensive watch again, but this time with a different purpose. "We've got 2 hours left in the flight," he said. "Let's make them count. I've got some connections in corporate training who could help roll this out industry-wide." Outside, the sun shone brightly on the aircraft's wings, seeming to highlight this moment of transformation. What had started as an incident of discrimination was becoming a catalyst for real change in the aviation world. 6 months after that memorable flight, the CEO stood on a different stage, this time at the International Aviation Conference. The grand ballroom was packed with industry leaders, all eyes focused on her as she shared her story. The huge screens behind her showed pictures from training sessions that had already reached thousands of aviation professionals. "What happened that morning could have ended very differently," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "I could have filed complaints. People could have lost their jobs. Instead, we chose to create change." In the front row sat the same flight attendant who had tried to remove her from the plane. But now she wasn't wearing a flight uniform. She had become the lead trainer for the new industry-wide bias awareness program. Her transformation from skeptic to advocate had become a powerful part of the training itself. In just 6 months, the CEO continued, "We've trained over 5,000 aviation professionals. But more importantly, we're changing the way people think." She clicked to the next slide, showing feedback from participants. These are real stories of change, moments when people caught their own biases and chose to act differently. The businessman who had been so dismissive that day was now a regular speaker at these training sessions, sharing his own journey of realizing and overcoming his prejudices. His tech company had become one of the first to adopt the full training program. "The most powerful change," the CEO explained, gesturing to statistics on the screen, "isn't in the numbers. It's in the small moments happening every day across our industry." She shared a recent email from a ground crew member who had stopped a colleague from making assumptions about a passenger. "These are the moments that tell us we're making real progress." The conference room buzzed with energy as she described the ripple effects. Major airlines had started implementing similar training programs. Private aviation companies were revising their hiring practices. Flight schools were actively recruiting diverse candidates. "But here's what really matters," she said, her voice softening with emotion. "Last week, a young girl came up to me at an airport. She pointed at my company's jet and said, 'I want to run an aviation company too.' And nobody standing nearby told her she couldn't." The room fell silent as she showed a final slide, a split screen of 2 photos. One showed her standing alone outside that tiny first office 15 years ago. The other showed her current team, diverse in every way, standing proudly in front of their company's fleet of jets. "That morning on the plane taught me something important," she said, looking around the room. "Change doesn't always come from big announcements or policy changes. Sometimes it comes from difficult moments when we choose to learn instead of blame, to grow instead of punish." The flight attendant stood up, joining her on stage. Together, they had become a powerful symbol of how a single interaction could transform into a movement for change. The audience rose in a standing ovation, not just for them, but for the future they were helping to create. 6 months ago, I was asked to leave a plane because I didn't look like someone's idea of a CEO, she concluded. Today, we're making sure nobody else has to prove they belong. Because in aviation, just like in life, excellence, leadership, and success don't have a specific look. As she finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. But the real victory wasn't in the applause. It was in the conversations happening afterward, the commitments being made, and the continuing changes spreading through the industry, one person at a time.